Hello, this is Simon Brew. I'm the editor of Film Stories magazine, and a very warm welcome to the Film Stories podcast. What's in it, you say?
I hope we're going to have some gratuitous sex and violence.
I certainly hope so too.
Come with me.
And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
In movies that had stories.
That the story just sucks them in.
This is just the beginning.
Stories. We would be honored if you would join us.
Hello, and a very warm welcome to Film Stories with Simon Brew. I am Simon Brew, as always. That's absolutely everything you need to know about me. The aim of the podcast, though, is given away by its title. I'm here to talk of the stories of films, and I tend to talk about production stories, marketing stories, release stories, distribution stories, 2 James Bond films in the same year stories, all the ingredients, really, that go towards making the films that we know and sometimes love. Just that, the films that we know and sometimes love. The films I tend to cover on this podcast, they lean more towards the mainstream than anything else. They're films I'm interested in or invested in to some degree. I try not to do snark. I try not to punch down. This podcast is a celebration of cinema and a real appreciation that somehow, films manage to get made. In each regular episode of Film Stories, I examine the tales of 2 different movies, and I'm just going to get straight on with it, if that's all the same with you. Each time, I set things up with a little clip from the trailer, and so I'll do that right now, and I'll come to the story of our first film, The Other Side of This.
Sean Connery is James Bond, Agent 007. Never say never again.
My name's Bond.
Oh, you're Mr. Bond. I believe I'm having you in half an hour.
Oh, splendid. Your room or mine?
Hey, Mr. Bond?
You're marvelously well equipped.
Thank you, James. So are you.
Good to see you, Mr. Bond. Things have been awfully dull round here.
And that is a clip from Never Say Never Again, dating back to 1983, directed by Irving Kershner, screenplay credited to Lorenzo Semple Jr., story by Kevin McClory, Jack Whittingham and Ian Fleming, and based on Thunderball by Ian Fleming, starring Sean Connery, Klaus Maria Brandauer, Max von Sydow, Barbara Carrera, Kim Basinger, Bernie Casey, Alex McCowan and Edward Fox. Never Say Never Again. Okay, so the James Bond saga, and I'm indebted as always when I'm talking about Bond to the wonderful book Some Kind of Hero by Matthew Field and A.J. Chowdhury, for a couple of decades had a splinter in it, and it went all the way back to the 1960s and the publication of the Ian Fleming book Thunderball. So a young writer by the name of Kevin McClory was among those who came up with the story outline for the eventual novel, the novel being published in 1961. Jack Whittingham also came in to do an outline as well. This was at first developed as a possible film project, and then McClory, at that point, an independent filmmaker, was potentially going to make it. Fleming would then write the Thunderball novel based on that outline, the book published in 1961. This was before the first official James Bond film had made it to the screen as well, it's worth noting. We hadn't had Dr. No, starring Sean Connery, at that point. McClory and Whittingdale were not happy, however, and sought an injunction. Now, that injunction could have delayed the publication of the book. That was partly the intention, I believe. However, it didn't in the end, but it did still go to court. And the court case was heard towards the end of 1963, after the book was out and was selling. During the case, Ian Fleming, the creator of James Bond, of course, and author of several James Bond novels, suffered a heart attack. And basically, they came to the conclusion they should just settle this. And fatefully for the Bond saga for the next, 50 years, really, McClory was given the literary and screen rights for the screenplay of Thunderball. And this was put in writing. Ian Fleming kept the rights to the novel. Within a year, Ian Fleming actually would have died from a further heart attack as well. but the James Bond saga itself on the big screen got motoring with Dr. No, which nearly clashed with the first James Bond movie, the unofficial one, Casino Royale, but not that one. And the film of Thunderball would then arrive in 1965, starring Sean Connery. Now, it included Kevin McClory as part of its production team as well. And part of the thinking there, in a deal overseen by the legendary overseer and producer of the James Bond series, Albert R. Broccoli, was that it would stop Kevin McClory pursuing a film take of his own based on the novel, which he apparently had the rights to do. And so by being part of the Thunderball production, McClory did this deal, and it stopped him for a decade making his own version of Thunderball. Pretty much as soon as that decade was up, at the mid-1970s, McClory was free to pursue another screen adaptation of Thunderball, and he duly did. At this point, the James Bond saga was, clearly in good health as well. That Sean Connery had realised the character of James Bond in the eyes of many on the big screen, hadn't played him since 1971's Diamonds Are Forever, and it was Roger Moore at this point who was the incumbent James Bond. The films were coming thick and fast, and McClory, well, he thought he had the rights to pursue his own James Bond movie. And so he was testing the water fairly quickly as well. A one-page advert was placed in early January 1976 in the Hollywood trade paper Variety, and it billed that this film was coming, James Bond of the Secret Service. Now, Lee Dayton, the novelist, was hired to work on a screenplay, and part of this was the plan to get Sean Connery somehow back involved. Connery was lured back to play James Bond, having initially retired the role, and it went to George Lazenby for On Her Majesty's Secret Service. After that, Lazenby, a one-time Bond, of course, Connery came back for one more run, at least in the official line, in Diamonds Are Forever, but was said he'll never play James Bond again. But McClory had met Connery in 1975, the year before that full-page advert was placed, and he knew that Connery had no intention of playing 007, but he also knew if he was going to pursue his own James Bond film, it would be good to have Connery's involvement somewhere along the line. So could he be persuaded to work on the script? Well, the involvement of Lee Dayton was certainly a help. Len Dayton was certainly a help with that. And so Connery and Dayton, they bounced ideas around, and so the film was soon going to be going by the working title of Warhead. Now, crucially, the rights of this was so tricky. It couldn't be a sequel. All McClory had was the screen rights to do basically another adaptation of Thunderball. That was it. He couldn't do Thunderball 2. He didn't have the screen rights for the James Bond character beyond that. And so it had to be pretty straight down the line what they were doing. The plan being to get filming in 1977. But of course, United Artists, Danjak, Eon Productions, all of the stakeholders in the official line of James Bond films were not happy and were happy to use legal matters to try and stop this. And so they were contending that the use of James Bond was theirs, with the exception of this singular Thunderball project where the rights were shared. And if anything strayed beyond that, they made it absolutely clear that legal action would be taken and the project would be killed. Still, by the late 1970s, in spite of this minefield that was developing, there was encouragement forthcoming, because it turned out Sean Connery was enjoying the development of the film. His head was getting back into this, and it was his wife in the end who suggested, well, why don't you return to the role? Because Connery's involvement was really important to this, because for better or worse, this was a risky project. As much as James Bond was known by this point, this was still kind of the upstart James Bond, the unofficial one, if you like. And so Sean Connery instantly lent it cachet. And Connery, of course, hadn't got on with Albert R. Broccoli for some time at this point, so he had no interest in placating or pacifying or working with Broccoli particularly. At one point, Sean Connery was apparently asked even to direct the film, but it was a real surprise when he confirmed he was willing to return as James Bond 007 in an acting role if the deal was right. Again, for the first time since 1971's Diamonds Are Forever. Well, the lawyers were busy. Of all the people who made money out of this Bond film, the lawyers were right up there, I think, because lawsuits and legal threats which had been simmering were now coming to the fore. Eon Productions, had been told, in fact, that Kevin McClory, as part of the rights that he had, apparently owned the screen rights to both the Spectre organisation, the most sinister organisation in the James Bond movies, and the character of James Bond's most infamous villain, Blofeld. And this instantly had an impact on 1977's terrific James Bond movie, The Spy Who Loved Me. It had to be altered. It couldn't have Spectre, it couldn't have Blofeld, because now the official line of Bond movies couldn't use those. Eon Productions would go as far as, in 1981's For Your Eyes Only, having a prologue of having someone who looked like Blofeld but was crucially, for legal reasons never named, being dropped down a massive chimney at the start of the film. Broccoli himself, he published his own memoir before his death, and he talked about some of this in there, and he said we sought an injunction against them, claiming among other things that they would be trading on our success, that they had milked ideas from previous Bonds, and by remaking Thunderball would be using more of our material than their own. Well, this was also scaring people off, that as much as it hadn't been properly tested in court, it was clearly going to be bruising either way, because Paramount Pictures had expressed interest in backing the unofficial Bond film, and yet Paramount didn't want to be in the crosshairs of legal trouble. And again, it was iterated over and over. Anything other than a remake, a strict remake, and Danjak, United Artists, would fire. Paramount backed off, and this was even after the studio, it had been announced in the Hollywood trade press that the studio was involved. Well, this was all slowing everything down, which was part of the plan, I think, for at least one of the parties here. And one person who was getting thoroughly fed up with it all was Sean Connery, and he was beginning to lose patience. I don't think he had a reputation of a particularly patient man at the best of times. Well, he was not particularly patient, and for a year or two, towards the end of the 1970s, the project was successfully strangled by litigation. In fact, it looked like the film wasn't going to happen at all until a man called Jack Schwartzman came onto the scene. Now, Schwartzman was a former tax lawyer. He had some experience of the tax system and also of the legalities, the legal system as well. And he was now in the film industry. He was an executive at a production company by the name of Lorimar, and he got hold of this script. And so he tried to get Lorimar interested in it, but that interest didn't hold for long. However, Schwartzman's interest would continue. And so when he left Lorimar, the film came back to him. And he was aware that this hadn't been legally tested. And he also knew, crucially, that there was a written agreement in place determining the film rights. A written agreement. Where's the ambiguity there, he wondered. And so he decided to take an option out on the project. And with Kevin McClory, he pursued the film, not through Paramount Pictures anymore, long gone, but as an independent film. Now, McClory, as the film developed, would not be heavily involved. And Schwartzman also, he got in touch with Albert R. Broccoli and told him what he was up to. Broccoli, too, would decline to get involved in the eventual movie, perhaps not for a surprise there, but the question, it's worth noting, was asked of him. So then it was back to Sean Connery. Sean Connery by now had ducked out of this, wanted no part of it, had gone on too long, and so he needed wooing again and met up with Schwartzman. And certainly a handsome paycheck was of use in the negotiations here. And by the end of 1981, it was being reported that finally Connery had signed on the dotted line. He was being paid a then massive $5 million as well to star in the film, at a point where his film career hadn't exactly been soaring. So a useful amount of money to come in, and also a high profile role. He also got things that stars weren't really getting at that point. He got a share of the profits. He had approval over key personnel. And so, and now obviously much older in his James Bond career, he was going to reprise the role. It's a pretty well-known piece of movie trivia that Steven Seagal was apparently schooling Sean Connery as part of his preparation as well. And it was Connery's wife again, Micheline, who came up with the idea of Never Say Never Again for the title, teasing that her husband said that he'd never return, so why don't they call the film that? Good plan. The film now had a name. Did it have the funding? Well, yes. Also, God, isn't that one of those irritating things where someone asks their own question and then answers it? Let me press on, because what happened was they sold, as with many independent films, the rights to this all around the world for distribution. The movie was going to happen with I think it was around 24 sources in the end, put money into the production to make it happen. And it was all officially announced in March 1983 that Sean Connery was going to come back for Never Say Never Again. Now, filming had got underway by this point as well, but in terms of the official announcement going out into the world, I did get it dated to March 1983. This was also, is worth noting, going into competition with the official James Bond film of that particular time, Roger Moore in Octopussy. That is not the last time I'll be saying Octopussy over the next 10 minutes of this podcast. The problem they had, though, once the film was announced, was they needed a new screenplay, because the Len Deighton, Sean Connery script had been dogged by legal problems. And so Schwartzman decided it wasn't worth the risk. He needed to go back to the drawing board here and brought in Lorenzo Semple Jr. Now, he brought him in once Tom Mankiewicz had turned the job down. Mankiewicz had done writing on Diamonds Are Forever, but out of loyalty, apparently, to Albert R. Broccoli, he decided not to join the, inverted commas, unofficial Bond. And so what Lorenzo Semple Jr. was wrestling was a script that had to mirror Thunderball tightly. Again, I keep coming back to this. And so when, he delivered a screenplay, Connery looked at it, wasn't really that happy with it. And so he called in some extra help, and he went to British sitcom writers, Dick Clement and Ian Lafreniere. Now, I've talked about them on an episode of Film Stories before, when I talked about the terrific Jason Statham headlined ensemble caper, The Bank Job. In the case of Clement and Lafreniere here, they were brought on board by Connery to basically tackle sizable rewrites for the film. Connery would use them again throughout his career, most memorably actually on The Rock, directed by Michael Bay. I've talked about that in a previous episode of the podcast as well. And so the script bit was motoring. That there were things in place to get that going. What there wasn't, though, was a director of the film. And so one of the very earliest people to be sounded out about directing the unofficial Bond was Richard Donner. Richard Donner at this point had come off the back of The Omen and the first Superman movie. And it was a real morale blow to the producers and to the team involved in Never Say Never Again when Donner took a look at the script and just went, well, nah, he just didn't like it. He just wasn't keen on it for whatever reason. And they were like, well, why isn't this successful director interested in this script? What is he seeing in it that's wrong? Now, a few other options were considered, but it was the success of a film by the name of, who knew, The Empire Strikes Back, a few years before, had put Irving Kershner firmly back on the radar of potential big movies. Now, Kershner had actually directed Sean Connery before, which was helpful. He was also known to Jack Schwartzman as well, which was also helpful. And as much as Kershner would admit that he wasn't really a James Bond fan when he took the job on, he was contacted by Connery and he decided to give take the challenge up, really, just give it a bit of a go. So all this was moving forward. The film was announced, but then by the spring of 1983, the film was being tested in court again, and there were more attempts just to delay it or hold it up. Kershner came aboard in the midst of this and just wasn't happy with Lorenzo Semple Jr.'s script either. It didn't help then that Kershner and Semple Jr. just weren't really getting on during the pre-production of the film. In fact, the making of Never Say Never Again appears to be littered with people who didn't get on particularly. But in the case of Kershner and Semple Jr., well, one of them eventually had to go. It got to that point. And what do you know? It's always the writer. Semple Jr. left the project. Now, Jack Schwartzman was married to Talia Shire, and Talia Shire has a very helpful relative by the name of Francis Ford Coppola. Coppola agreed to take a look at the script at this point. And so, there was Dick Clement working on it, Ian Lafreniere working on it. All the while, money was tightening as well. It's worth noting, again, this was not being done as a big, loud, official James Bond film. This was having to be funded and put together as an independent movie. And so as much as the cast was coming together, Barbara Carrera, Kim Basinger, Klaus Maria Brandau was a Connery suggestion as well. It was just tightening up. It was going to be tricky. Now, Douglas Slocum actually came to the film to shoot it after just off the back of making a film called Raiders of the Lost Ark. Wonder how that would turn out. But in September 1982, production would get underway on the movie. It would shoot at Elstree Studios in the UK. It would go to the Bahamas. It would go to Spain. And you had this weird kind of moment where 2 James Bond films were going before the cameras at exactly the same time. And so, perhaps unsurprisingly, the media was stirring up the idea of the Battle of the Bonds. And what a great story as well. The 2 most successful actors as James Bond, Sean Connery and Roger Moore, were now both playing James Bond in brand new James Bond films coming out in the same year. And they were going to come out really, really close to each other as well. At the heart of it, 2 people who were getting on fine actually were Connery and Roger Moore. However, 2 people who weren't getting on fine were Connery and Jack Schwartzman. Because Schwartzman at this point, I mean, he wasn't really a film producer. His background was in legal work, was in tax work, and as much as he'd been attached to the entertainment industry, producing a film, not least a James Bond film, and trying to wrestle the budget that they had to make a film of this scale was felt to be a little bit beyond him. Now, from a producer point of view, from a financier point of view, he did keep putting his hand in his pocket to cover shortfalls in the budget, but still, in terms of the actual production of the film, Connery was not impressed. Connery had decided to play his Bond just as a slightly older Bond in the end, but there had been conversations about, well, this is a retired 007. Could he have some facial hair? Could Connery have his natural lack of hair on top of his head? Well, in the end, they resisted those. Connery memorably wore a hairpiece for the movie, and there was no facial hair above or below his mouth. And then while it was shooting as well, Dick Clement and Ian La Frenais, well, their work wasn't done. They would remain with the production throughout, rewriting the script, for which they got 0 credit. The Writers Guild of America would not give them a credit on the movie. Instead, it went to Semple Jr., who got financial reward for that as well. But it was Clement and La Frenais who were watching the daily footage coming in from the film, and they just knew that it was in trouble, that what they were seeing wasn't making a fat lot of sense, and they had to do their best to fix it. They were sorting out a mess that they hadn't made, really. So they're in a fairly advantageous position, but still, it was a lot of work that needed to be done. So, for example, one creation of theirs was a character by the name of Nigel Small-Fawcett. Turns up as a rep of the British Foreign Office in the Bahamas. Rowan Atkinson hired in for that particular role. Going to just the troubles of the shooting of Never Say Never Again as well. One famous story was when Irving Kershner saw footage of Connery's stunt double for the film in action and couldn't really work out who he was supposed to look like. He argued that this particular stunt double had looked nothing like him. And the story goes that the production design had cast a stunt double based on Connery's look in 1960s Thunderball rather than in the early 1980s where age had just played a few tricks on him. It wouldn't be until 1983 when production would wrap up, at least principal photography would wrap up on Never Say Never Again, and there was Octopussy was ahead of it as well. And knitting the film together in post-production was, it turned into a bit of a problem. That even in post-production, dialogue was being written to cover up plot holes. They had to be quite nifty with the editing, do a bit of additional dialogue recording, cover it with some clever edits. They also had the problem that the early cut was really long. Not uncommon with movies, but this was going to about 3 hours, and there's no way they were going to get away with a 3-hour James Bond film, official or not. And even while they were wrestling with so many problems making Never Say Never Again itself, well, Eon, Danjak, United Artists, they were back firing out another court case. They went to the UK High Court to try and stop the release of the film. This time, though, the High Court ruled in favour of Never Say Never Again and that particular team, and the official Bond side had now run out of road. What they did, though, was get their film into cinemas first. The Octopussy was debuting in the UK in the summer of 1983 in June. It had its royal premiere in London, and there was still work being done. There was still new material being gathered for Never Say Never Again, even as Octopussy was playing. And so 8 months or so in the end of shooting on Never Say Never Again. again. And Connery, I mean, Christopher Bray's biography of Sean Connery, called The Measure of a Man, is well worth digging out, published by Faber and Faber. And the line from Bray's book is, Connery, who had famously bridled at the increasing duration of the original Bond shoots, would doubtless have been chomping at the bit, even had the movie been expected to take so long. But it hadn't, which meant he was more furious than ever. And he said the end result, he would say, quote, seemed as long as all the other 6 I'd made put together. They did get the film finished, however. Never Say Never Again will premiere in London in December of 1983, and there was royalty there. Prince Andrew sweated his way through the film's debut. Connery, though, even ahead of the release of the film, would just rail against it. That at an event the night before, I think it was, the night before the premiere, he would be talking about the level of incompetence that had gone into, so much incompetence, he said, had gone on during the making of the movie. By the time he got to the end of it, he just wasn't really talking to the producer. And so it was coming down to, well, is the film going to be any good? It had already debuted in America in October 1983, the UK release in December of 1983. And, well, I mean, the reviews were all right, really. In fact, they were quite good. Now, I've rewatched Never Say Never Again fairly recently, and I just don't think it's particularly strong. Really, I remember watching it at the cinema when it came out. I'm that old. I remember wondering why it didn't have the proper gun barrel sequence at the start, but of course they weren't legally allowed to use that. So you've got this weird logo board with 007 just appearing just on the screen in front of you, and so many of the trappings of the James Bond films, the official ones, were missing. But critics liked seeing Connery back in the role of 007, and there was generally some admiration for it. It does sort of help that Octopussy hadn't been wonderfully received by critics earlier in the year, but still, it was, as always, it was going to be the audience that was going to decide the fate of Never Say Never Again. And so with that in mind, let's just dig into the US release of the movie. It was Warner Brothers who picked up the release for the film in the US. They get the home video rights as well. And it had a handsome opening as well. By 1980 standards, a $10.9 million opening weekend in 1983 was quite something. And the return of Sean Connery was clearly welcomed by audiences. The same week, the films that were around, I mean, in second place was The Big Chill with $4 million. So it was number one by a lot. Other films in the top 10, how about this lot? Romantic comedy, Mr. Mom with Michael Keaton, Risky Business, Revenge of the Ninja, Brainstorm, Beyond the Limit, the first National Lampoon's Vacation, and Flashdance was hanging around the chart as well. And Never Say Never Again would go on to be, a pretty good hit as well. That, I mean, it was number one at the US box office for several weeks. It was, in the end, it was dislodged by Deal of the Century. That took about 5 weeks before that happened. And its total gross around the world, once you factored everything in at cinemas, was, once everything had been factored in all around the world, around $160 million. So, it took a while for that total to come together. And so the initial comparisons were slightly different, but not bad, really. And so Never Say Never Again fared well enough at the box office. Now, it had been a more expensive film to make than Octopussy. Never Say Never Again's production cost was said to be around 30 to 36 million. Octopussy was close to 25 to 27 million. And it took less than Octopussy at the box office, but still, it'd been pretty decent number, not least because Octopussy had been able to open in the summer. Never Say Never Again had to wait till the autumn. However, Sean Connery, just wasn't happy at all that he was insistent this time. He was never going to play James Bond at all. It was just going to be a one-off return. And Kevin McClory had tried to tempt him back once more as well, but it just wasn't going to happen. He'd had his fill of this. He'd not enjoyed working with Jack Schwartzman, and Schwartzman declined to take up any kind of option to make a further film as well. And so, I mean, in terms of the Battle of the Bonds, it was Roger Moore and Octopussy that won out. But Sean Connery in Never Say Never Again didn't too badly. But I mean, it was a bit of a knockout blow, really, for Connery's time as 007. In fact, Connery was said to be not just disillusioned with the film, but also with the broader industry as well. And it would take a few years, really, for him to get full-on rehabilitated. That it was 1987's The Untouchables that would win him an Oscar. But I will name-check the fact that in 1986, what a double bill this was: Highlander and The Name of the Rose. And so, I mean, it was in a strange way a turning point in his career, because financially it secured him, but it put him off certain parts of the industry pretty much for good as well. The final scores did see Octopussy outgross Never Say Never Again, and for many years until his death, Kevin McClory looked to do a second remake of Thunderball. It was always going on in the background, even as Pierce Brosnan and Daniel Craig took on the tuxedo of James Bond. In fact, for a long time, Eon Productions couldn't use the character of Blofeld, couldn't use Spectre. It was only after McClory's passing that it was that this changed, and so in 2015 we got the film entitled Spectre. Until then, James Bond had been fighting a sinister organisation called Quantum. Lots of retrofitting was done, etc., etc. I think you know a fair chunk of that. I've covered that before on this podcast. Broccoli's memoir, incidentally, also, he was clearly sore about this whole episode, and in the years that followed, he would insist on corrections and damages if a newspaper felt had wronged the way that the battle and the rivalry between Never Say Never Again and Octopussy was reported, that he took legal action against The Sun and the Sunday Times magazine successfully, I believe, as well. And as Broccoli said, it's hard for me to understand this side of Sean's nature. This is from his biography. By any standards, Bond was the best thing that happened to him, but that is for him to judge. To have him complain that I was dishonest with him, which Connery had done, was hurtful and, as he well knew, untrue. Now, the rights to all of these rights belong to Eon Productions. In fact, the rights to Never Say Never Again belong to them as well, which accounts for the fact that the home media presence of this unofficial James Bond film is pitifully poor, and it's hardly omnipresent on streaming services too. It is an odd curio in the history of James Bond, though, and an unlikely swan song for Sean Connery in the role of 007. And that brings me to the halfway point of this latest episode of Film Stories. As always, thank you so much for listening, and thank you for your time. Just a few parish notices before I get on to the second of the two films I'm going to talk about. Firstly, this podcast, thank you for listening to it. I can't thank you enough for that. There are a couple of extra ways to support it if you're so inclined to do so. Thank you to everybody who's done this. Thank you just for listening, though. I'm utterly genuine about that. If you want to support the Film Stories podcast financially, you can do so by going to patreon.com/Simon Brew. If you put a few coins in the pot there, you get the podcast early pretty much every week. You get it ad-free as well. You find out what we're up to behind the scenes. Costing you nothing was to subscribe to this podcast at your podcast home of choice, and also costing you nothing is to leave ideally a hugely positive review as well. For independence without marketing budgets, stuff like that is absolute gold dust in doing battles with the evil algorithms from the planet Mars. So thank you to everybody who's done that, and if you don't mind, it's hugely, hugely, hugely appreciated. And then I have print magazines as well. I've got Film Stories magazine, issue 51 is in production at the moment, and the latest the latest issue of Film Junior, the only print magazine for under 15s that's all about film as well. It's not the only print magazine, it's the only print film magazine in the UK that I know of. Then you can find that also at store.filmstories.co.uk. A new issue of that is on the way too. But that's my parish notices. I've kept them as brief as possible because I want to get on to the second of the two films I'm talking about in this episode of Film Stories. We're going to the back end of the 1990s this time. Let me play you a clip from the trailer, come to the story, the other side of this.
I don't know. I don't like it. What do we got to have a meeting for? Let everybody else worry about their own business.
This meeting is how we're going to survive.
Meet Paul Vitti.
How you doing? Feel great. Never felt better.
A mob boss with a problem.
Yeah, I got stress.
Based on everything, I'd say you had an anxiety attack.
I need you to find me a doctor, a psychiatrist.
Dr. Sobel?
Listen, mister, you can't come in here. This is a patient's private session.
You know me?
Yes.
No, you don't.
Okay.
You see my picture in the paper?
Yes.
No, you didn't.
He's got problems.
Well, yeah.
You are my shrink.
You don't hear the word no very often, do you?
I hear it all the time, only it's more like, no, please, no, no.
You've got an accent to
Analyze this. In my world, I deal with animals, Doctor.
Want to be a ribeye? Get away from the car. What is my goal here? To make you a happy, well-adjusted gangster?
I'm very angry, and I'm trying to get some
Closure
on that.
You get a dictionary and find out what this closure is.
You know what I do when I'm angry? I hit a pillow. Try that. Just hit the pillow. Feel better?
Yeah, I do.
And that was a clip from 1999's Analyze This, directed by Harold Ramis. Screenplay credited to Kenneth Lonergan, Peter Tolan and Harold Ramis. Story, Lonergan and Peter Tolan, and starring Robert De Niro, Billy Crystal, Lisa Kudrow, Joe Vittorelli and Chaz Palminteri. The starting point here was Kenneth Lonergan. Now, Kenneth Lonergan, as we know him now, is a lauded filmmaker, and not least for, a collection of particular projects. Gangs of New York, he was screenwriter on that. He wrote and directed Margaret, wrote and directed Manchester by the Sea, and also the terrific You Can Count on Me as well. Kenneth Lonergan also is a multiple Oscar nominee and also an Oscar winner for his screenplay for Manchester by the Sea. But this was the first of his projects to make it to the big screen. When we find him in the 1990s, he's, a pretty prolific playwright, really, and always someone looking for ideas. And it was an interview with The New Yorker. He revealed what became the catalyst for Analyze This. And he talked about how his mother and stepfather were both psychiatrists and both also practicing analysts. And as the New Yorker piece revealed, a dinner table anecdote from his stepfather about a colleague who was approached for treatment by a member of the mafia provided the premise for Analyze This. That Lonergan would pen the script when he was in his early 30s. It wasn't the first screenplay that he'd written, but he looked to write a film to basically support his quote, less lucrative vocation as a playwright of tight focus character dramas. The script then went out into the Hollywood system, and one person who got hold of it, and there's some wooliness over the dates, but I think it was in early 1997, was Billy Crystal. Billy Crystal spent a lot of the 1990s hosting the Academy Awards. He also had hits, City Slickers, a big hit. When Harry Met Sally had hit big at the end of the 1980s. And he'd been looking for film projects throughout the decade, and he liked this one, and it was he who brought in Peter Dolan to work with him on the script. The idea was that he would play the shrink character in the film. He would also executive produce the movie and do a little bit of screenplay work. He wasn't the only one who did screenplay work, though, that in the end there were said to have been 7 writers on the film, and it's only 3 of them ultimately who get credited. But there's also some muddle over who owned the screenplay first. So I found one article, I think it was the Los Angeles Times, that said that it was producers Paula Weinstein and Jane Rosenthal came in with Robert De Niro because Robert De Niro's production company Tribeca had owned the project, had put it into turnaround, and then Paula Weinstein picked it up with Warner Brothers. Now, I think Billy Crystal came in just in the early stages of that. And, Lonergan had penned the screenplay, had found the buyers for it. And, it took a long time to get through. George Gallo was another writer who took a go at it. And between Gallo and Tolan and Crystal and Lonergan, there were lots of voices going into the script. In fact, as we're about to find out, there are a few more voices that were going to go into it as well. So when did Robert De Niro find it? I've second time in this podcast I've done that, asking a question I'm going to answer. Well, the story I found was he was in France making Ronin when he took delivery of the screenplay for it. And he toyed with the idea of doing a comedy that's kind of sent him up a little bit. And he got to the point in his career where he was looking for a fresh direction. He'd proven that he could do comedy with the Sublime Midnight Run, but he kind of resisted doing something that ridiculed the roles that had, let's face it, done particularly well for Robert De Niro over the years. Still, as he took hold of the script, a man called Richard Loncraine was attached to direct the film. He'd worked on The Missionary, a period drama. He was also on Richard III, the Ian McKellen Richard III as well. Harold Ramis at this stage had apparently been approached, as he explained to the Chicago Tribune, but Ramis had just moved back to Chicago and had promised his family he'd spend a year pretty much uninterrupted there after several years in Los Angeles area making more and more films. Now, Crystal was pretty convinced that this was a perfect Robert De Niro project, and he met with studio executives who weren't that keen on the idea of De Niro as the mob boss undergoing some degree of counselling or therapy. Still, Crystal put in a call to De Niro, and I mean, this is explained in his book, Still Fooling 'Em. It's a really good memoir, actually, Billy Crystal's. And he said, De Niro called me 2 days later and suggested that we do a reading. And so they did that reading in the conference room at the mega agency, Creative Artists Agency, CAA. And Crystal said, I sat across from the great De Niro, and with a good cast in the key parts, we read the movie. He got big laughs straight away, and I could see him enjoying himself. We had a natural chemistry, and I couldn't get over the fact I was acting with him. But De Niro's not one to make a quick decision on his film projects. Let me think, he said. And Crystal acknowledged his concerns were legitimate. How far should he go with this character? Would it hurt his chances to play a mob character again? As it turned out, no, but he wouldn't really do it for a little while. Would he be making fun of himself? And Crystal said, I felt the audience would love it if he winked at himself. Winked, I said. It would take several months before he would make a decision, but De Niro decided, yeah, he's going to give this a go. However, one thing they were going to need fairly quickly was a new director, because Richard Loncraine would be replaced on the film in the spring of 1997. Now, with De Niro circling the project, there was a suggestion that Martin Scorsese might direct it. In fact, he'd just come off the back a year or two before of Casino with De Niro. Of course, they'd made Goodfellas at the start of the decade as well. But Scorsese wasn't really interested. He turned the film down. This was the era where he was making films like Kundun and Bringing Out the Dead. There was a moment where Billy Crystal and De Niro considered co-directing as well. Both had directed at this point. Billy Crystal with Mr. Saturday Night, a surprisingly dour film, but the recent Broadway musical of it, which I had the pleasure of seeing, much more upbeat and better, I would suggest as well. De Niro had made his directorial debut with the terrific A Bronx Tale, and they looked at co-directing, but in the end, it was Harold Ramis who was tempted back to the film. He took a look at the script and agreed to do it. He was hired, and as he did on most of his films, as he did on Groundhog Day, he would take that script and he would do a pass on it himself, that he would do a rewrite and really work out what the Harold Ramis version of it was. He would do his work on the script for the film back in Chicago, where he could be closer to his family, and he would explain to the Chicago Tribune that he had problems with it. He said, I thought the therapy was too easy. He said Billy Crystal was too self-aggrandizing in a sense. It turned him into Freud. He puts this whole thing together in a very melodramatic way. And he said everything was just given straight out, just said, and he said he felt it was sappy. It took until the spring of 1998 when they considered they had a working script for the film. And now Robert De Niro was also going to produce. By this point as well, Lisa Kudrow, Chaz Palminteri, Joe Vitarelli had all signed up as well. The news that De Niro was going to be co-starring had landed the year before. So, I mean, this was out in the open. But it took some time to get to production. It would be on May the 11th, 1998, in New York, Florida, New Jersey, that Analyze This would get shooting. Now, De Niro, in terms of the chronology of what you film, asked that his character's anxiety attack scenes were shot first, because those were the ones I think he was going to find the most difficult. A meticulous preparer, really, Robert De Niro. Even as his career went on, Sean Levy's memoir of him talks about this quite a lot. In his early days, he would prepare, and he only just was starting to relax about this point in his career. And so De Niro would turn up on set that first day. He would look sleepy and unshaved. And as Crystal tells the story, they then worked through a rehearsal of the first scene they were going to shoot with Harold Ramis. And then they'd come back 2 hours later to actually shoot it. And there was De Niro, absolutely banging character. He was clean shaved. He was in a very, very luxurious suit. And also, he was out of his comfort zone. He knew it as well. And Crystal says how De Niro whispered in his ear, listen, if you see anything you think could be funnier, let me know. He said, just take me aside with any ideas. And this really took Billy Crystal aback, really. Here was Robert De Niro, regarded as the greatest actor of his generation, just being really open to whatever Billy Crystal had that would make his character better, that would make it funnier, that would make it work. Crystal talked as well about just how much he loved playing the straight man to De Niro. And he says De Niro's technique was fascinating. He said he loves to keep doing different versions of line readings, all of them coming at you at lightning speed. He would keep going back and starting over as you repeated lines 4 or 5 times, each with a different spin to it. And Crystal just felt Robert to the rest of us, made me better just by being great himself. And he said, I played a man who listened for a living. It wasn't a long shoot. The filming was done in under 2 months. On June the 25th, 1998, filming wrapped up on Analyse This, and post-production could duly begin. There was, however, a bit of an unexpected elephant in the room, because Analyse This in the end had been funded by a partnership between Village Roadshow, the Australian financier with whom Warner Brothers had just struck a deal to co-finance a bunch of films, and Warner Brothers itself. Now, Warner Brothers also had HBO in its asset register, and HBO had this new TV show that was debuting at the start of 1999 about a mob boss going into therapy. That TV show would be the groundbreaking The Sopranos. And as Harold Ramis would argue, and this came up on the press tour more than once, he said The Sopranos, which also features a mobster in therapy, of course, it's not a comedy paced like ours. It's so different in intent. And he admits he'll always put a positive spin on things, but he did note too that Billy Crystal was quite concerned at The Sopranos coming out 2 months before Analyse This. These projects are overlapping one way or another, and as Ramis told, because Time Warner owns HBO, Crystal was said to have thought, how could they do this to us, release The Sopranos? And as Ramis said, if it's terrible, no one's going to see it and people will stop watching it, and if it's great, people are going to want to see more. And he figured it could only rub off, and he sort of proved right as well, that when Analyse This was released into cinemas, it did find an audience, and it did find interest as well. So let's go through it. I mean, the release of the film was March the 5th, 1999 in the US, and the critical response to it was pretty good. It wasn't great, it was pretty good. However, the one thing that was drawn out, well, the two things were the 2 lead roles from Robert De Niro playing with type, really. The fact that it was a comedy was, by the way, I mean, he was playing this mob boss character, but also Billy Crystal playing against him. And I think it was Roger Ebert who also saved some special words for Joe Vitarelli as well. But it was the script itself wasn't said to be particularly great, but the actual core concept, these 2 actors playing against each other, De Niro just kind of playing off the role that he'd cemented on the big screen for many years, well, that was successful, and the thinking was audiences might just go for it. The movie itself had cost $30 million just for the negative before promotion and such like. The opening weekend of the film, $18.3 million. Pretty handsome numbers, that, for a comedy. In second place, opening that same weekend, was Cruel Intentions with $13 million. Nicolas Cage headlined Joel Schumacher's 8mm. That was in third place, down to, it was the number one the previous week. Had great $7 million that weekend. The Other Sister was sat in fourth, Payback in fifth, October Sky, really nice little movie, October Sky, was in sixth. My Favourite Martian, Message in a Bottle, Shakespeare in Love, She's All That. And so Analyse This was doing all right, and then its drop the following weekend was just 15%. Now, usually films lose a lot more than that. Turned out there was a lot of competition as well. I mean, to put it in context, on its second weekend, Cruel Intentions lost 46% of its business. Pretty decent, that. In the case of Analyse This, its second weekend was 15.5 million, still at number one, against, I'm counting, 4 or 5 new openers in the top 10 as well. Them being The Rage, Carrie 2, The Corruptor, Baby Geniuses, The Deep End of the Ocean, and the Wing Commander movie as well. And the word of mouth was helping Analyse This. It was knocked off the top spot by Forces of Nature, starring Sandra Bullock and Ben Affleck, but still helped itself to 11 million on its third weekend. Fourth weekend, still in second place, as films like Ed TV and The Mod Squad and Doug's First Movie didn't dislodge it. And then The Matrix came along. All bets were off when The Matrix came along. Do you know The Matrix opened the same weekend as 10 Things I Hate About You as well? 1999 was an amazing time to be going to the movies. Analyse this, even as the hits kept coming throughout 1999, though, just kept going on the big screen. It stayed in the charts for a long time. It was actually on release for 43 weeks in the end. And it would take, 10, 11 weeks before it would drop out of the top 10 chart altogether. By which point it had grossed 106 million in the US, 70 million outside of the US as well. And that was enough to get people talking about doing some kind of follow-up. Before that, it's worth noting that Analyse This was one of the earliest films too to have a very big success on DVD, the then burgeoning DVD format as well. It was a very extras-packed DVD. I remember importing it. This was a film that took a long time to come to the UK, so I remember I'd imported the DVD and watched it by the time it arrived on UK cinema screens. The sequel to follow in 2002, that would reunite Peter Tolan, Peter Steinfeld and Harold Ramis actually on the script, Steinfeld being the new addition to that. Harold Ramis directing, and there's De Niro, Billy Crystal, Lisa Kudrow, Joe Vittorelli, Kathy Moriarty added to the cast. Lightning didn't strike twice, though. Twice as expensive and half as popular, a third as popular, as it were. The reviews were just not anywhere near as good. The film's not anywhere near as good, really. I think if you look at the first Analyse This, it paved the way to the Meet the Parents films, which were far more successful, I think, really, for De Niro's comedy. But Analyse This remains, I think, a good film, a good, fun film. Analyse That is pretty forgettable, really, and just your fairly standard Hollywood sequel that takes like 50% off the original film and really had no one particularly clamouring for another movie. The Sopranos, meanwhile, was absolutely burning it up by this point. Kenneth Lonergan would admit many, many years later, in fact, it was while promoting 2016's Manchester by the Sea, that he never actually saw the film in the end. He was talking to Mark Maron on the WTF podcast, and he said the film, it was rewritten. It was one of my first Hollywood experiences. And he said, I wasn't surprised at all because I knew what I was getting into. But it's been rewritten by 14 people, he said. There's not really a word of mine left in it except the title. He said the idea behind it's mine. Originally, the kind of humour that's in it is mine, so I take some credit for it. But it was just rewritten totally out of my... He just said, I've seen bits of it, and it does seem very funny to me. He wasn't punching down on the film. He just said it wasn't really him. The film then, it's the best part of a double pack, and it is the movie that kind of broke Robert De Niro into comedy. It is not his best comedy outing, but in a year, loads of stuff is said about the cinema of 1999. Books have been written about the cinema of 1999. It's easy to overlook, though, this hit comedy that sat there in the March of that year, just almost minding its own business, that turned into a real surprise hit in a year that was not short of surprise hits. It was the 15th highest grossing film of that particular year. There was Phantom Menace, Sixth Sense, The Spy Who Shagged Me, Toy Story 2, The Matrix. But if you'd have put a bet on it being 100 million grosser in the US, at the start of 1999, I don't think you would have had too many takers. And that brings me to the end of this latest episode of Film Stories. As always, thank you so much for listening and thank you for your time. If I've not bored you completely, you can find more from me on Twitter and Blue Sky at Simon Brew. You can find more from the entire Film Stories project on both of those platforms at Film Stories. We're at Facebook, facebook.com/Film Stories Online, youtube.com/Film Stories. You can find our web store at store.filmstories.co.uk, which has got all of our print magazines and our Blu-rays as well. They're all for sale there. And if you go to filmstories.co.uk, that is updated every weekday with movie news, TV news, reviews, features, things like that. We are trying to make a clickbait-free entertainment website, which is a lot easier said than done. The easy way to do it is clickbait and cheat people to get people to read it. We don't want to do it, but we need your support to be able to do that. You will find it at filmstories.co.uk. And that Patreon again, patreon.com/Simon Brew. Thank you so much for your support. As always, the main thing is you all take care. You all look after yourselves. I'm off to watch some more films. I will be back soon with some more film stories. Until the next time. Bye-bye, folks. Bye-bye.